So your research centers around what you said, cultural
Translation.
cultural translation. Okay, can you explain exactly like what that is?
Absolutely. So I'm a cultural sociologist, which basically just means that I study how people and groups give meaning to things and try to make sense of the world around them. And specifically, I look at cultural translation, which is how those meanings then spread from one group to another and how they're transformed in that movement. So a lot of times we think of ideas just spreading around the world almost like a virus, that they just move around by themselves. But as sociologists, we actually look at how there are a lot of people behind that movement who actively take ideas and translate them into a different cultural context. So it's not just a matter of it's not a transparent process where something is simply transformed into another language, into another context, but there are a lot of different people in a long network that are working together to bring that new idea. And in that process, there's always something that gets kind of added or lost in translation. So I'm really interested in that process and what happens when an idea moves. I don't know if you played when you were a kid that game. We call it telephone in Ecuador,
Yes,
where you
yeah.
like whisper in someone's ear and they whisper into the next kid and the next kid. And always the message itself kind of gets distorted. And it may be because one kid wants to be funny and changes the message, or maybe somebody misunderstands or doesn't really hear the message. And it's the same more broadly. Obviously, that's a simplification, but more broadly in culture. So an idea, a piece of media, a piece of a cultural script, a narrative, they always spread around the world through different people who are taking them and reinterpreting them and transforming them. So I'm really interested, very broadly speaking, in that process.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, we talk about in psychology something similar to that. We say when there's bias, it gets amplified. The more it goes like through person after person, it just gets amplified, right? So you'll hear a story, and then if somebody has any bias, by the time it gets to the 10th person, it's like completely different story. But, when it comes to things like human rights, which I know that's where a lot of your work centers around, when you look at cultural translation in the lens of human rights, like what is that? Like when you because I would think that human rights would be the same, like pretty universal, right? But it's not. We see that in a lot of different countries. So how is it translated culture by culture, and how is it different?
Absolutely. And there is human rights by definition is an idea that aims to be universal. So they are defined, like human rights can be a set of legal documents, a set of political stances, a political movement, but also fundamentally it's an idea that everyone inherently has value and rights just because they're an individual. And so the interesting thing about human rights is that how that idea then is applied in different places, again, varies not just because there is, as you say, this bias where it becomes the narrative is transformed as it moves through one particular network. But there are many different translators and many different people reinterpreting human rights in different ways. So my research focuses mostly on children's rights and things like child violence against children or child labor and what kind of activism exists trying to prevent those harmful practices. And what's really interesting is that you see a lot of people with great intentions who are trying to get out there and help kids around the world and protect them from work. But the people who are drafting these international conventions and creating these international campaigns are in one part of the world, and then they work with different intermediaries and different allies and partners in different parts of the world, and that gets translated into different local policies and national campaigns, and that in turn is applied in different ways in specific communities around the world. And almost unavoidably, the goal, the expectations, the priorities kind of shift through this movement. So even though everyone is saying like, oh, we're all part of the global fight against child labor, to give you like one really small example, in the international arena, a lot of people are focusing on like, okay, what are the causes of child labor? How do we define child labor? How do we draw the line between acceptable child work and unacceptable child labor? And then you see that through this long chain of people may slightly disagree with those things or may slightly blur the line between those two activities, and things get lost in translation. And you get things like a well-intentioned campaign inadvertently stigmatizing children in a very specific sense. So to give you just one example, there was this huge campaign in the 90s against sweatshops in Bangladesh because it was a very common practice and people wanted to boycott products that were created in sweatshops. And this was very effective. There was a lot of shaming campaigns going on that closed down these sweatshops. But what got lost in translation was that people were only looking at one part of the problem, at the demand side of the problem. And they didn't realize that those kids didn't have anywhere else to go. It's not they boycotted the sweatshops, they closed down these factories, but what happened with the kids? There was a study that happened a year later and found that a lot of these kids were still living on the streets, were in more dangerous occupations, had not necessarily gone back to school. So what you see is that even though in the global arena, in the international conventions, in the different conference rooms where people and advocates are getting together trying to fight child labor, they had all of these aims. That aim was kind of diluted in the process of being applied in the local context. And weirdly, a lot of kids fell through the cracks. And so that's what I'm really interested in how this idea of human rights works in theory versus in practice, and how can we make sure that those align as much as possible.
Very interesting. And I know you're writing about something that caught my eye, which is good intentions, unforeseen outcomes, right? Exactly. And so we talk about that in psychology, like good intentions, and then sometimes they have bad outcomes, right? Now, I can imagine there are a lot of different barriers when it comes to cultural translation. Like you have like the language barrier, you have the money barrier, you have like barriers around morality. And so for some countries, it's okay for kids to work. In other countries, it's not, right? So how are they doing business? How are they getting around that, right? So I know that the United States will outsource to different countries that let children work for pennies a day, right? Because those countries, they allow that, but we don't allow that in the United States, so we go around it. But when we talk about good intentions and unforeseen outcomes, okay, so can you explain a little bit more about that? Maybe like what you're writing about, maybe like a preview of the book or something?
Absolutely. So I'm focusing specifically on campaigns against child labor because there was this article I ran into in Bolivia a few years ago. There was this march. A lot of children who were in child labor came out and marched on the streets and marched towards the presidential palace in La Paz. But weirdly, they were protesting for what they called their right to work with dignity, which was very striking to me because, A, it goes against everything we assume about children. We assume that kids are apolitical, that they're not choosing to work. And most of the time, to be fair, they're not. They are being forced to work because of extreme poverty or inequalities or lack of access to services. But these kids were demanding the right to work. And what was striking wasn't just that they were going against kind of the global idea of what children should be doing and going against the global campaigns, but they were doing so in the language of human rights. They were calling it a right to work. They were framing it in this very international way. So that's kind of what got me started in this research. And what I found was precisely what you're talking about, this idea that these very good intentions are creating these unforeseen outcomes, which in the case of the working children in Bolivia, kids were being stigmatized when people wanted to actually protect them. So there was something going on in the campaign, something was being lost in translation, that what is a campaign that is explicitly about protecting the dignity, potential, and childhood of children was weirdly making children feel attacked and making them feel stigmatized and worse off because of it. So I really wanted to understand where this was happening, what had gone wrong in that process. And what's interesting is that a lot of times when I talk to people about my research on child labor, they will frame it almost like a global versus local debate. So there are all of these global ideas, but in the local context, there's, as you say, there's a different culture. Okay, let me backtrack. As you say, in the local context, there may be a different cultural assumptions about childhood or child labor. There are different economic realities. There are different, as you say, language barriers. In Spanish, the term is trabajo infantil, but in English, we have two terms, child work and child labor. Child work we usually assume is something that's acceptable, that's good for kids. So think of like a kid with a paper route or having a lemonade stand or all of those archetypical images of working children, as opposed to child labor, which we assume is bad because it's wrong for children to work, of course, in factories, in large-scale agriculture, in mines, and things like that. But in Spanish, there's only one term for both, so there's a lot more conceptual slippage between the two. We don't have a different word for work and for labor, and that makes it very difficult when we are implementing these campaigns. And at the same time, you're absolutely right. There are just different economic realities, there are different cultural assumptions about childhood. So a lot of times people frame this as kind of like the global, universalistic human rights perspective versus the local traditional culture. But when you pay closer attention to what the kids are actually saying, they're still framing it in terms of rights. They're still talking about these in very explicitly moral terms. And what I found is that it's not just that there's something quote-unquote backwards about the local culture that is making people defend child labor. It is something about the campaign itself that they're not realizing that they are causing this resistance. They're not realizing that in the campaign, something is getting lost in translation. So just to give one example, the people who are starting these campaigns in UNICEF, in the International Labor Organization, they're always very careful to talk about what causes child labor, and they talk about these structural issues and inequalities. They never want to blame parents because they say parents don't want to send their kids to work. It's because of these conditions in which they find themselves that they can't help it. That's kind of the broader narrative that they're telling. But when I started interviewing people in local governments, in local NGOs, and providing direct services to families and children, a lot of them kind of shifted that story and did start blaming parents and made it less of about structural inequalities and more about individual flaws. So they would say things like, oh, the parents are lazy, the parents are sending their kids to work because they don't want to work, the parents are bad parents, basically. And so you see how the message moves from this international arena into the regional, national, and local spaces and starts changing. And that inadvertently makes children feel attacked rather than protected and pushes a lot of them into these movements that defend child labor. So the story is being lost in translation, and that is kind of creating this problem that nobody intended to create, if that makes sense.
Right. So then it works in a cycle, then, is what I'm hearing. So then how does one go about breaking the cycle? And then does that involve other countries getting involved? Because we see, like, when the U.S. gets involved in other countries, and when it comes to things like morality, you know, the United States and the Western, like, culture abides on a completely different moral code. I was actually just talking to, so we have a lot of international students here at Harvard for the summer right now. I ran into a couple, and then we were chatting. They were like, yeah, you know, it's a huge culture shock coming here because, you know, like, people are just treated completely differently. You guys have a different set of moral codes that you go by. I was like, yeah, you know, it's a lot different than where this person was from Morocco. So it's much different. So if the U.S. were to get involved with a country like Morocco and something like this, would that be a good thing? How would that work? You know, so do countries get involved, and does it work?
Yeah, there's a lot of, I agree with you completely. There's a lot of pushback to especially countries with imperialistic histories like the US. So in some place like Bolivia, for instance, a lot of times people, if they thought that something was coming from Europe or the US, they might push against it, especially if people have some kind of reason to doubt the well-intentions of those political actors. So after Bolivia, actually, after this march that I told you about, the kids protested and the police came out to stop the march and threw tear gas over the kids and kind of repressed very violently the march. And this created a big scandal in Bolivia. And so after that event, there was a lot of political maneuvering trying to deal with this scandal. And then President Evo Morales met with the marching children and these organized kids and asked them what they wanted. And he actually listened to them. And there was a reform in the law, and Bolivia lowered the minimum age for employment. So according to international standards, kids should not work until they turn 14. But Bolivia created an exception to that law, saying that some kids, under certain circumstances, could start working at age 10. And so this, again, brought a lot of pushback from international organizations, from other countries, among them the US. And there was a lot of pressure from these countries. And in the next few years, the law was reversed. So now, once again, the minimum age is 14. So countries did get involved. But weirdly, that undercut the goal. Like, a lot of the marching children and these organized working children who have now created social movements defending child labor, they often frame it like you're saying. Like, they say, like, oh, these imperialistic powers came and are trying to tell us what to do, and they don't get it. Our culture is different from their culture. And it's become this very politicized, very polemic issue in Bolivia. And so I agree with you completely. It's not a matter of the US coming in and telling Morocco or telling Bolivia or telling anyone else how to live their lives. But at the same time, human rights are by definition universal. And so international organizations, not necessarily a specific country, but organizations like the International Labor Organization or UNICEF are working hard to try to spread these ideas worldwide, avoiding these kinds of pitfalls of these global inequalities. So that's part of the translation process, that it matters who the idea is coming from. So if the idea comes from someone you feel connected to or you feel you have more in common with, you're more likely to be open to that idea. But if it comes from someone that has all of this historical baggage, like in the case of Bolivia, the United States, you're more likely to reject that idea. And that is also something that I'm finding in the field.
So if we look at morality in between different societies, right? One of the things that you find when you look at, like, the founding of civilizations, a lot of them are founded on religion. which is very interesting because if I found a society right now and I say something like, okay, killing is wrong, but that's just me saying it. So somebody else can come along and say, well, I don't think that killing is wrong. I don't care. So then we're in a standoff, right? We're in a bit of a standoff. But if you say killing is wrong because of this religious text, which is now above humans, and this is like a moral code that's sent down from the heavens. And so if we believe that, then we're more likely to adhere to that moral code. So when we look at morality and we look at societies that are founded in religion and ones that are not founded in religion, have you studied any of this, and do you see any differences between the two?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And as I said, I'm not an expert in the sociology of religion. But one of the things about the sociology of culture is that we do study morality and moral frameworks a lot. We kind of take a step back. So we don't necessarily say, like, this is the correct framework and this is incorrect. But we actually say, what do these frameworks mean for the people who use them? So in your example before about your friend from Morocco, what do moral relationships or moral codes mean in Morocco versus the United States? And even within the United States, what does it mean for this group of people versus this other group of people? For members of this political party versus that political party? Or this gender identity versus that gender identity? So we look at these comparisons. And one of the things we find is that even societies that aren't explicitly religious, even societies that are very secular or that present themselves as very secular, say France, for instance, there are always certain things that are, as you just described it, above people and above society. So even if it's not considered a sacred religious text, there are still what are called sacred texts. So in the case of France, it would be the Declaration of the Rights of Man, for instance, and all of these very civic texts and ideas that come from local philosophers and thinkers, but are still treated almost as religious in the sense that people abide by them and that they are not open to questioning in the same way that for a person who has a certain faith, their religious book or their religious prophets or leaders are also not questioned in quite the same way. But I do agree with you that it's interesting that there are societies that are much more openly religious and that is something that is creating a lot of differences in the world today. So sociologists historically have talked about, you mentioned Max Weber in one of your previous podcasts, they always talked about this kind of trend of secularization. So societies used to be very religious, but now more and more, the more modern you are, the more secular you become. And that theory has kind of been debunked now because we see that we are extremely modern around the world and still religion is such an important part of people's lives. And I think it is because of what you were saying before, that people need to find meaning beyond themselves, need to find a sense of solidarity with others in something that they can latch onto that isn't just because I say so. But I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen as you asked, like how does that create differences between societies? I think we all latch onto an idea of the sacred, be it something in religion, be it civil religion, meaning something in our politics, in our civil society. Some people find something transcendental and sacred in their family unit. Some people find it in their employment. There are scholars now who talk about how people see capitalism almost as a new religion, or some people see work as a new religion. Other people talk about how popular culture has become a religion for some people who define their identities by their fandoms or by the kind of pop culture they consume. So I think that we're seeing the development of new kinds of religion, but that is also creating problems, as you say, in that people don't necessarily weigh all of these frameworks in the same way. Like people will not necessarily agree that they all have the same validity.
Yeah, so it seems like exactly like I forget the sociologist who said this, but it's one of like the founding fathers of sociology who said, like, if you belong to a society or to a collective, you're more inclined to act alongside with that collective. But we even talk about that in psychology with like cultural evolution and people belonging to a culture. You're less inclined to go against that culture because you receive too many benefits from it, right? So if we look at our society and we were to say like the government shut down. So if the purge was real, I personally think if the purge was real, I don't think that people would commit as many crimes as they think, like on the movies. I don't think so. I think that people are held to a moral standard that they've become very conditioned to believe, right? So it's almost like even if you're not religious, it's like, okay, maybe the Declaration of Independence is your religion. Or like your inner moral code is your religion, which is very interesting to think about. So I wonder, when you talk about cultural translation, it's much different in other countries. So for example, here in the United States, it's okay if if a woman's wearing short shorts and you walk down the street, it's normal. Nobody even like bats an eye at it. If you wear that in Kenya, it's completely different. completely different. And so it's like a different set of morality, right? So it's like, I wonder how that, like, how is that, do you get what I'm saying? Like the cross-culturalization of it. Right?
Absolutely. And that's exactly what I'm interested in. And that's why I love studying cultural translation, because there's a sociologist called Lynn Spillman who says that culture is basically how we make meaning of the world. But meaning making, she says, is like air. We're not paying attention to the air that we're breathing most of the time. We're just doing it. We're just breathing and going about our lives. But you realize the importance of air the moment that there's no air left, or that you feel that you're in a different altitude and there's less air, or whatever. You understand the comparison. So I think it's really interesting to study cultural exchange and cultural translation, because that's where you see these things that we normally take for granted, like in the example you just gave, how dress codes and how people take for granted certain forms of dress in one culture and don't realize it until they go someplace else and they receive some kind of pushback. So I think that, as you said before, your friend from Morocco made you realize certain things about the United States because they were experiencing a cultural clash, because they came with a different cultural language, so to speak. And so I think that that's why it's so interesting to study cultural exchange and translation, because you get to pay attention to these moments of friction where things don't necessarily, where you kind of pay more attention to things you take for granted. Sociologists love, have you heard of breaching experiments in sociology? No, I haven't. So there are a lot of sociologists in culture, I'm trying to remember the name of the sociologist. I should know this. But anyway, he talked about, there is a famous sociologist who talked about breaching experiments. So a lot of times in interactions, we follow certain rules of interaction that we don't even know that we're following, and we only notice them when somebody breaches them. So he would send his students out to do these experiments, like walking into an elevator, but instead of turning around and facing the closed door, just facing the people in the elevator. And everyone would get super uncomfortable and not know what to do. And people would get upset with this person for not doing anything, for just looking at them when in a small space, you're kind of expected to not make eye contact. You're expected to try to pretend nobody else is there. Or he would send the students back home for Thanksgiving, for instance, and in a conversation, act as if every word has to be defined perfectly. So their mom, for instance, would say, how is school? What do you mean by school? You know, the place where you study. What do you mean by study? And they would keep asking, and it became very annoying very quickly. And that just goes to show that in a conversation, it's not just two people exchanging ideas, but two people also exchanging ideas in a very particular way, where you don't question certain things and where the patterns of interaction are very scripted. And so I think that on a much larger scale, that's what happens when there are moments of cultural encounters. When you go to a new country and people eat in a different way, or pray in a different way, or even drive in a different way across the street, all these kinds of things makes you realize what is normal for you and what is cultural for you, and make you realize how artificial it is as well. Why have we decided that certain forms of clothes are appropriate or inappropriate? We just have, as a society, decided that these are the things that we take for granted, and that becomes more noticeable when you just go someplace different.
Interesting. Okay.
Have you had those experiences even within the US?
Specifically what?
Like any kind of experience of culture shock, for instance.
Not really in the United States. I will say, well, actually kind of. So I'm from Georgia originally, and I've gone down to like South Georgia and like the very, the deep, deep South country part. And it's like, it's a bit of a cultural shock if you're black down there. You know, it's not necessarily the most accepting place in the United States. So that's a bit of a culture shock. There was one when I came up to Harvard, because there are a lot of international students. So the place that I'm from, there's nobody that's international, right? And so going up there, you meet a lot of people who have different ways of communicating, different ways of orienting themselves when they walk around. A lot of people will do things that will be seen as rude by traditional United States standards, but it's not rude in their country. And so it's like, it's always like an awkward little encounter when things like that happen. But in terms of culture shocks, no, not really. I haven't left the United States yet. So it's probably coming pretty soon when I leave. So, yeah.
Absolutely. But I think that that's really telling, that even in a country like the United States, you find different experiences depending on the state you're in, or the institution you're in, or the people who are around you. When I first came to the US, so I'm from Ecuador originally, And I remember one of the culture shocks was just email etiquette. We would send emails that were so long and so convoluted. Like if I were to ask someone for something, a professor, can I meet for office hours? I would email them and I would give like 3 sentences of preamble explaining who I am and why I need this and will you please? And I know it's such an inconvenience. And it was such a weird way of emailing that I took for granted that you need to be extraordinarily polite because it's the biggest favor somebody can give you is giving you their time. And then the professor would answer back like, yes, one word. And I would assume that they hated me and that this was terrible. And it was just because people here are very blunt and short in emails. Like you don't have to, it's not a letter. You don't have to go through all of the rigmarole that I was doing just because that was what was common when I was back home. And now that I've lived in the US for so long, when I get an email from an international student, especially someone from Latin America, I can always tell because the emails are so long and so complex. And it's just because that's how you interact with an authority figure in that case. But yeah, that's definitely something that happens when the modes of communication are different.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about sports because I've taken your sociology of sports class. I know most of the people who watch this will not have taken your social sports. So how do sports, we talked a little bit in that class about how sports bring cultures together, right? How does that happen?
Yeah, I think sports is such a fascinating, so quick disclaimer, I am not an athlete at all. I am interested in sports completely as a fan and as someone who finds this sociologically fascinating thing. And I realized how fascinating it is actually during the pandemic because the pandemic kind of made us all take a close look at our priorities and what matters to us. And I think that when different sports started closing because of the pandemic, and then when time went on, how much people missed sports, it kind of showed the importance of sports in society. Why do we care so much about people running around after a ball or jumping into a pool or throwing something? Like, why is it that these activities that we're not even doing ourselves matter so much to people? And there are a lot of different possible answers to that, but I think it's precisely because of what you were saying. It's a ritual that we're all watching together. So the fact that we all are in the same audience, we're all engaging with the same kind of activity at the same time. When something happens, you can call your friends or even tweet strangers and things like that. The kind of relationships are created through the shared viewing of an activity. But also because sports, I think, has a way of crystallizing a lot of very abstract meanings that are important for people. So sports are usually competitions. They're usually about what does it mean to win? What does it mean to win well? What does solidarity or generosity or teamwork mean in the context of social life in general, but of sports in particular? So a lot of times it's really hard to talk about things like fairness or justice or success. What do those ideas even mean? They're very abstract. But when you have a team that is playing dirty or playing well or winning in a very strategic way, it allows you to kind of feel and understand those abstract concepts in a much more concrete way. Sorry. So I feel like sports is, like the anthropologist Clifford Geertz said, it helps us tell ourselves stories about ourselves. So we get to learn what it looks like to win, what it looks like to work hard. And that's why we enjoy these spectacles so much, because they crystallize all of these abstract notions that we need for our day-to-day lives. And I think that that's why we put athletes in particular in such a high pedestal and treat them as role models, but also pressure them to be role models. And we are so unforgiving when an athlete fails in some way because we have these expectations that they are these larger-than-life symbols for us as an audience. And as a sociologist, I find that fascinating. I find it really interesting that we are all watching these same activities. We are all giving these activities all of this larger-than-life meaning. And I think that's the power of sport. The power of sport is to unite us because it's just a very effective spectacle, a very effective stage in which we work through our values as a society, I think.
Interesting. So you said, and this is going to segue a bit from sports, but we're going to circle back to it. But you said one word that really caught my attention, which is ritual. Mm-hmm. And you refer to sports as a ritual. So in psychology, we know that rituals bring people together. Rituals help with a ton of things. They help with grief. They help with loss. They help with anxiety, depression, all of the above, right? Now, it's the same with sports, actually. So, and it's very interesting because I've never thought of sports as a ritual per se. But if you look at the benefits of sports, they do help a lot with anxiety, with depression. A lot of people, even if you consider going to the gym a sport, a lot of people when they're depressed will go to the gym and they feel better from that. And the collectiveness of going to the gym with or playing a sport with people. So rituals throughout cultures bring people together, but even cross-culturally, they bring people together. For example, so if I go play basketball in a random country with people who I don't speak their language, I don't know anything about them, or if we play a really good game of basketball together, we're brothers for life after that.
Absolutely.
Which is very interesting. So even with cultural translation when it comes to sports, okay, so interesting to look at it from that lens. What's lost when cultures translate from different sports?
When I say that things are added or lost, sometimes it's a normative judgment in the sense that like the meaning that was very important is lost and it gets diluted. Sometimes it's just a matter of things being reappropriated and given a different meaning. So it's not better or worse, it's just different. So for instance, one of the things that I've studied is the globalization of soccer. And people play soccer around the world, and they always follow the same rule, or they usually follow the same rules. They're within the same international federations. They all aim to go to a World Cup. Soccer has these standardized principles that happen. If you want to play soccer, and if you want to call it soccer, it has to have the same rules, the same requirements, the same standards. But the meaning that people give vary by place to place and by different contexts. And sometimes it's something as superficial as the uniforms colors that people choose or the types of chants that people sing. So chants in England are very different than the ones in Latin America, that are very different than the ones in Asia or in Africa. There are all of these different ways in which the superficial trappings or the aesthetics of the sport might differ from place to place, but also the deeper meanings might differ. So for instance, the United States is a very individualistic country. And a lot of times, athletes in the US are athletes and audiences define success as individual success of the athlete. And you might enjoy that the athlete has a foundation that supports certain communities or that they're helping their family and mom. But the biggest impact an athlete has is how successful the athlete is. And one of the things that's striking is athletes here are very braggy and they love talking about, I am the greatest of all time and I am the best because of this. And these are my stats and these are the things. But when I was doing research on soccer in Ecuador, in particular in poor rural communities in Ecuador, one of the things I found is that people were much more communitarian in their view of sport, and they enjoyed sport not because it brought individual stars to prominence, but because they saw sport as a way of bringing a community up and about the networks that were created through sports. And there were actually a case where one of the athletes from this community went on to play for the national team and was very braggy. And there was a social cost for that. People hated that athlete for saying he was the greatest of all time and he was the best because they thought, no, the ideal is to be humble, is to be connected, is to be true to who you are and not forget where you came from. And just the meaning associated to those behaviors in sport were just different because of the expectations of the context. So you can have a soccer player in the US versus one in Ecuador. They're both successful in the same game, but their reception is going to be different based on the community, and probably their understanding of what success means in sport is different based on the community. So what's interesting is that everyone's playing the same game around the world. Everyone's watching the World Cup and supporting different teams and whatnot. But the meaning associated and why the sport matters is very different by place to place, and that is the process of cultural translation.
That's interesting. So even if we look at something like the World Cup, per country, it's way different for each country that wins. So I know the day the U.S. wins a World Cup, if that day ever comes,
Maybe.
the bragging will probably never stop, ever.
Yes.
However, for different countries, that's not the case. You know, like that's not why they're in the World Cup, like you were saying. It's for being humble, or it's to celebrate the country itself, right?
Right. And I think the World Cup is such a fascinating ritual because it brings everyone's attention to the same game. And this last Men's World Cup was fascinating just to see the different reactions of people. And I spoke to a lot of people who in the final were saying, I support Messi, but not Argentina. Or people saying, I want Argentina to win because I hate France. Like there were all of these different interpretations and readings of the same exact match. And of course, there is a sense that everyone is watching the same thing. There is this, what sociologists call homogenization process, because a lot of local differences get flattened if everyone is doing the same thing and watching the same thing. But there is also this reappropriation of the game and of the joys of the game and of the ritualistic aspects of the game by different communities and by different people.
Tell me a bit more about your research and some of the projects that are like very impactful to you.
So my research, I started off being really interested in cultural globalization in general. So I started off with soccer and sport, then I went into the area of human rights and the globalization of that. And I'm still very fascinated by these issues. I'm currently working on a project with UNICEF on violence against children and how we define violence around the world and how can we create these kinds of universal standards that best protect children. So that's been fascinating, and I'm still really interested in pursuing that kind of research. But one of the things that was really interesting and that started to come up more and more, especially during my current child labor research, was the question of stigma and recognition. So there is this new push in cultural sociology to study not just culture, but how culture both contributes to, but can help fight against inequalities. And one of the things that comes up again and again is that inequality isn't just about how many resources different groups have, or access to services, or access to power. It also has to do with cultural and social recognition. So there are certain groups that are stigmatized more than others. There are certain people who are seen as more or less worthy than others. And that's contributing to these discriminations and to this different access to resources. So Michelle Lamont here at Harvard is doing a lot of research on recognition and how can we enhance social recognition across groups and fight against different types of discrimination. There are also other scholars like Abigail Sigoy. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She studies, for instance, fat phobia and why is it that certain kinds of discrimination or certain kinds of phobias are still more socially accepted than others, and why does that happen? So I'm really fascinated in pursuing that kind of research as well. And why is it that certain stigmas appear or disappear, and what is behind that? So for instance, during the pandemic, there was this really interesting movement where on the one hand, people were recognizing essential workers who had been doing work that is usually considered less valuable. So people who are cleaning or people who are collecting garbage or people who are doing essential work that is usually considered, quote unquote, dirty work that is not as valuable as being an executive or a banker or a doctor or whatnot, but being somebody who works in funerary services. There are all of these kinds of occupations that are more stigmatized than others. But during the pandemic, we all kind of realized how important those occupations actually are because they help for society function. If you don't have somebody collecting garbage, then your quality of life reduces dramatically and disease will spread and all of these other issues come up. And so there was, at the start of the pandemic, this push throughout many big cities around the world to applaud essential workers every day at 5 or at 7 and to recognize that kind of work. But obviously, now that things have gone back to normal, I'm really curious to see if people's lives did or did not change because of that recognition. And there are also a lot of more information now about people who were doing essential work during the pandemic that were actually facing new forms of stigma. So people who worked in hospitals had their cars defaced or vandalized or were yelled at out of their apartment complexes and things because people were worried that they were going to bring the disease. And so I'm really interested in studying this kind of occupational stigma and what it means and how it might change. Because sociologically, it's fascinating to think about why do we decide that certain things have value and others don't. But also practically, I'm really interested in how do we change those hierarchies of value? How do we make it so that people who are cleaning hospitals or are helping us bury our dead or things like that we historically have considered distasteful, how do we help those people gain the recognition that they deserve? So that's kind of what I'm thinking through as a possible second project. Right now, it's all very tentative, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, given the importance of stigma and recognition in creating or reducing inequalities.
I see. So you talked about recognition and recognizing like the essential workers. One of the things that I know they were looking at over at Harvard Business School is during the like the pandemic and the 2020 protests. Companies like DoorDash and Uber Eats started to label companies as Black-owned, and they were seeing like an increase in sales for those companies. But they ended up stopping the campaign because other other how will I say this? Other groups of intersectionality were coming out and saying, well, if you're supporting black-owned businesses, why don't you support these other people and all these people? So it became like a huge snowball
Yeah,
effect of
good
everybody
intentions
asking
and
to be
unintended
supported, right?
consequences.
Unintended consequences,
Yeah.
right? So now that we're unintended consequences, right? So now that we're 3 years removed from that, I wonder if, okay, did black-owned businesses sustain that increase in sales? And did that actually help them, or did it hurt them in the long run? Did it sort of like, did it create a sense of resentment throughout a lot of different cultures or a lot of different people in the United States? So it's very interesting to look at that. Like, good intentions, like you said, good intentions, unforeseen outcomes. But what I wanted to circle back to is you talked about child violence. So when my dad was growing up, their teacher could discipline them physically, and that was normal. Nowadays, if a teacher touches a kid, they're done. That's it. And so since we were talking about cultural translation and societies wanting to get involved in other countries, United States trying to dip their hands in every single country ever, do you think that we could see ourselves transitioning towards like a universal, maybe like like a universal law system or some sort of regulation that's pretty universal, and that whatever the world's superpowers are at the time get to dictate what is moral and what is correct and what's generally acceptable
That
amongst
is
all
a
countries?
huge question. I think yes and no. So I think that there are some ways in which, even though we don't realize it, there are a lot of ways in which countries around the world have become more and more similar over the past few decades. To give kind of a banal example, airports around the world are almost exactly the same. Some may be bigger, some may be more luxurious, some may have better amenities, but the basic function of an airport, the kind of way in which we organize time, how we distribute the space, how we decide where you go through immigration, where you go through the security check, that has become very standardized around the world because airlines around the world expect that and travelers expect that. And so if you want to have an airport in your city, you have to follow certain international standards that don't necessarily come from one country, but may come from these international organizations and corporations. So that's kind of the basic example, but you're asking about something deeper, which is morality. And there are many ways in which the world has become more similar. Most countries around the world now at least want to be or try to appear to be democratic. So we have electoral systems around the world. People follow basic universal ideas about education. So there's a lot of debate about what should be the content of education, but nobody's really debating whether we should have schools for children. Most countries have schools for children and teach math and science and culture and history and what have you. And of course, if you look very closely, even in the United States, there's a lot of debate about what can or cannot go into a history book. But there's never any debate about whether we should have history books or whether we should have classrooms or things like that. So if you take kind of a step back and look, around the world, there are these ways in which we've agreed that this is how you educate children. We agreed that people should have rights. That doesn't mean that necessarily most countries around the world are providing human rights for children or are recognizing the human rights of children and adults and members of different vulnerable groups. But it's very rare for a country to come out and say, I don't believe that people should have any human rights. People may not necessarily practice what they preach, but at least everyone is preaching in a very similar way. So it's a difficult question because on the one hand, we have become much more similar and we are creating these standards. And one of the ways we do so is just by having international organizations like the United Nations, by having organizations like the World Bank that are not just advising countries around the world on how to create laws and policies, but are also measuring things and defining things. So there's a sociologist at Stanford who's called John Mayer, and he has this hypothetical case, which I love, which is what would happen if tomorrow we discovered an island in the middle of the Pacific that we'd never heard of before and that has a population? What would happen? If this was the 1400s, there would be all of these debates about whether people on the island were actually people and have souls and deserve to be citizens of the world and whatnot. we wouldn't have those debates today. We would assume that people are people. We would grant them rights. We would send scientists to measure their health. We would send census takers to count how many people there are. We would determine whether there are a certain number of men and women and children and adults and elderly, and we would measure people's lives by year. There are certain standardized ways in which we observe and take stock of the world around us. So even if we don't know anything about the people in this island, we would probably discover certain hierarchies and inequalities. We would discover certain health and economic issues or certain progress that they have faced that we haven't. But we would still define the people in this island, in this imaginary island, using the language that we have created as a planet or as members of international organizations and research structures. So it's really interesting to think that yes and no. We're never going to all agree on morality, but we're all going to agree that poverty is a problem and that we should measure it. And we all use similar ways of measuring poverty or measuring inequality or measuring health. So even you can know how many people are stunted, meaning that children have grown less than 2 standard deviations to the norm. But that norm is something that we have decided as societies that this is what the standard human child should. This is the standard height that somebody should have at this particular age. So there are a lot of ways in which we do have these commonalities. Of course, the more you get into things that are more explicitly moral, like religion, like relationship between different genders or different ethnic groups or what have you, people get a bit more defensive and are less likely to abide by international standards. So I think it's always going to be a push and pull, that there are always going to be a lot more things that we have in common than we realize, but there will always be these differences that are going to be hard to overcome.
I see.
Mm-hmm. I'm really curious about I love that you're so interested in these deep moral questions. I'd love to hear more about where that interest comes from. And why one of the questions that you mentioned in your email is what kind of society we should strive to have. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. Like, what do you think morality does for society? And where do you think we should go?
Yeah, absolutely. So I personally am a very religious person, but I've gone through my fair share of phases where I was questioning religion a lot. And I think when you are blessed to be around a lot of intelligent people and a lot of knowledge and books and surrounded by sociologists, psychologists, and stoics, everything, it's easy to really question religion. But one of the things that I think religion is very good at is creating a clear moral code. Like, as difficult as it is to adhere to the Bible's moral code, I think if somebody adhered to it, they would live a very good life. It would be very boring, I think. I think it'd be very difficult and it'd be hard, but it would be pretty straightforward, right? But I question morality a lot because there's good and evil in the world, right? And it's easy to, like, for example, I was pondering the question, will we ever reach a society where everything is completely equal? And my personal answer is no, I don't think so, because I think so long as there is greed in the world, there will always be inequality. So as long as somebody is greedy and there is a hierarchy, there will be a chance for the person at the top to act on greed and the person at the bottom to be screwed over by the person at the top, right? So I always wonder, okay, well, what is moral? How can I define morality? Because I can't define it. I don't get to tell someone what is morally acceptable for them to do. So who does, right? Is it power? Is it money? Is it somebody who's at the top because they have power and influence and they've worked super hard and they get to tell me now what's moral and what's not? Is it because I have a book that was written thousands of years ago and that I hold in high regard and I pray every day? Somebody else has a different book and theirs says a different thing per se. And now this contrast, there's conflicting views, right? So what is even moral? Can anybody ever say what's moral? So I always like to ask, okay, well, how can we intertwine different types of morality into society, right? To settle on a society that is accepting for all people to have their different moral codes per se, but also to adhere to one moral code that doesn't interfere with each other, right? One of the great things about America is that there's freedom of religion. So I can be Christian, someone else can be Muslim, and someone else can be Buddhist, and we can all just do our own thing, and that's fine, right? In other countries, that's not the case. In other countries, you can kill people for living by a different religion, and that's morally acceptable. Who got to decide that in the first place? So that's how I got on those topics. That's how I was thinking about those things. I would have these discussions with my friends all the time, and we would always come to pretty much inconclusive answers, right? Nobody can really answer these questions. But I think it's very interesting to think about. My dad's also very religious, so I ask him a lot of questions as well, questions about the Bible, questions about things that are happening in society and how they align with the Bible or how they don't align with the Bible. When I talk to people who have different culture shocks, like the lady from Morocco, she said specifically, she was like, "Yeah, I'm used to being treated like a woman, and you guys don't do that here in the United States. I've only lived in the United States, so I only know that. I don't know what it's like to be in Morocco." So it's like, okay, she's viewing our society as pretty immoral by her standards, right? But those are her standards. Who decided what that was going to be, right? So even if we look at psychology, we look at conditioning, right? If you're raising kids, you're raising children, you pretty much get to shape what their views are going to be in life. So when I raise children, I can pretty much tell them what's moral and what's immoral. And they're very inclined to believe me, right? And it will take a lot of backwards conditioning by the time they get older to stop believing what I tell them, right? So if someone's raising their kids in a different country by different rules and different standards, that kid comes to America and they decide, for example, hey, I want to make change. I want to make change in America. I want to pursue becoming an academic and letting my research make change, or going into politics and letting that make change. Well, because you were raised in a different country under a different set of moral standards, when you come here, how is that gonna cultural translation? How is it gonna be different? You have good intentions, different outcomes because you're in a different society. So those are the things I like to think about that I would be potentially interested in researching.
Those are fantastic questions. And I think what's really interesting about what you're saying is that on the one hand, some of these questions are irreconcilable. So some people say God does not exist. Some people say God does exist. How do you reconcile those two positions? They're incompatible. You can't. But there are a lot of other ways in which translation is the great metaphor here, because just like there may not be a word for Schadenfreude like there is in German, we can still learn what that means by context, by using different words. It means gaining pleasure in the misery of others. We can still translate. We might need to use more words. We might need to contextualize it in different ways. So I think that having a research project where you look at how religious ideas can or cannot be in conversation with each other is absolutely fascinating, because there are a lot of things that religions do have in common. There are certain moral standards. Do not kill, do not lie, do not steal are tenets for most religions around the world. But then there are all of these other ways in which the taken for granted culture and religious standards are different. And so understanding those similarities and differences and where they come from and why they matter, I think is a fascinating project that I'd love you to study and tell me more about eventually.
Yeah, well, I will keep you updated on it if I do it.
When you talk about your dad, my dad is also very religious, and I love having these conversations with him. But sometimes he will tell me, like, you are very much an academic. There are things of faith that cannot be answered in an academic, scientific way. And that's okay, too. I think that it's really interesting to think about how you can't really know all the answers. And that's very frustrating for someone who's curious and wants to have it all packaged in a clean and simple way. But I think that it's still worth questioning, and it's still worth talking about, even if it does end up in a ambiguous or not completely satisfying place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. To answer your question more explicitly, because I don't think I really answered the specific question of what makes a society moral, in my opinion. In short, I don't know. In long, it's impossible to say. You know, if you have a society based on religion, like I said, there's so many different religions that you can't really pinpoint one as being the most moral of them all. I personally like to believe that Christianity, my religion, is the most moral of them all, and that's what I adhere to. But if I talk to somebody who doesn't believe in Christianity, or they believe in a different religion, or they're not religious at all, I can't prove that God's real, right? Like, I can't go up to heaven and bring God down and say, hey, here's God. I can't do that. So we'll have to agree to disagree. But the fact that both of us live in the same society, well, now it's a little different. Now I can't force my moral code on you. You can't force yours on mine. So where's the code? What does it come from? So that's why I can't say that a society is moral or immoral. I don't know. It depends on how you're raised. It depends on what you've been conditioned to believe, and the powers that be that are above us all that pretty much determine everything, right? So just very interesting to think about, in my opinion. Yeah.